Good evening, everyone. Time is 6:30, and I'm calling to order the May 16th, 2022 Borough Council work session. That is our call to order. Next is our Pledge of Allegiance, please led by Mr. McCoy. Thank you. Okay, next we have item number 3 on our agenda, which is comments, suggestions, petitions by residents in attendance regarding items that are not on the agenda. If anybody wants to has a comment, come on up to the mic, state your name and address for the record. No? Okay. Thank you. Next, we have our presentation by students at the Westchester Friends School. This is in regards to drinking fountains, water bottle refilling stations in the borough. I'm really excited. I see we have lots of the students here. So if anybody wants to come up and start, I don't know if there's somebody. All right. Yeah, it's great. Yeah, just make sure when you talk, you come up in front of the mic and speak. Yeah. Did you send it in? Yeah. Okay, Mr. Mann, I'll get that 1 second.
Good evening, everyone. We are students from Westchester Friends School and members of the Quakership Leader Team. Our group would like to propose ideas for the borough to help reduce the use of plastic bottles.
You may know that in 2018, the Quaker leadership team from our school led the project to reduce plastic in the borough by asking for the Borough Council to ban the use of plastic bags. The Westchester Green team aided in the effort to reduce plastic use in Westchester by proposing a ban on straws. The Westchester Green team is very enthusiastic about this new project and would be supportive of having it go forward.
One plastic bottle takes about 450 years to decompose and is really harmful to the environment because it's there for so long. An estimate of about 100,000 marine animals die from plastic water bottle pollution each year, and we can help eliminate a lot of that from the borough by creating the water bottle refill stations. About 35 billion water bottles are thrown away in the U.S. each year, and that takes a big toll on the environment. Around 8 to 9 million metric tons of plastic end up in the ocean each year. Around 1 million water bottles are bought around the world every minute.
As you can see from our previous slide, plastic is very harmful to the environment, and we would like to help reduce plastic use in the borough. We have 3 ideas to share with you. Through our research, we saw an idea that started in the United Kingdom called Refill. We would like to do something similar here in Westchester Borough to help people change their habits and make it easier to live with less plastic. Our group wants to ask businesses in the borough to participate by putting a sign in their window showing that they are available to refill reusable water bottles for free. We would like the borough to support us in these efforts by listing the names of the businesses that are participating on your website.
Here are some ideas for signs for that each business could put in their front window.
We also would like to propose an idea that the Borough Council could find a way to install refill stations in the borough. 2 places that might be easiest to start with are a Borough Hall and possibly parking garages. The Borough Council could work with Chester County and the property owners to see if they could help in this effort.
Another area to consider putting refill stations is in the borough parks. There are already water fountains there, and it might be easy to change them to a refill stations. There are many visitors that come to the parks, and instead of buying water, they could use the refill stations. Would you consider adding refill stations to the John O. Green Memorial Park, Everhart Park, Marshall Square Park, and Hoops Park?
Thank you for allowing us to share our ideas with you. With your support, Westchester Borough can continue to be an environmental leader in the reducing plastic use.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. This is a really well thought out, amazing idea. And I want to thank all of you. What grade are you all in? You all in the same grade? Fifth graders? Third grade. Wow. Awesome. That's amazing. So nice for you to come and join us with such an incredible idea. Really well thought out. I appreciate all the ideas and the fact that you have ideas already thought of to answer some of the questions I was already popping up in my head. So council, anybody have a comment on this or any thoughts on this? My original, sorry, go ahead, Mr. Caro.
I just want to say thank you very much. Your presentation was thorough and very helpful. I want all of these things to happen. It's going to be work to make these things happen, but I want to work for you. Thank you, guys.
And I think, these are ideas to start somewhere, and this is something that probably wasn't something we were thinking about. So I want to appreciate you all to bring that to us. My initial thought was we are really working on planning the open air marketplace by closing down Gay Street in a more permanent fashion going farther. I think that this is something that we should look at for building infrastructure and having it available if we're going to have people walking. And I definitely think adding it to water fountains in the park is an amazing idea. I use a water filler every day. I work at a school, so every day I fill it up and I don't use any more plastic bottles. So I agree, it's an amazing idea. So thank you very much for presenting. Thank you. Okay, that was an awesome presentation and something that I know we'll be looking at going farther. All right. Moving on to item number 5, presentation approval of the Westchester Rail Restoration Study, ESI, eConsult Solutions, INC. I know, that was very concise and to the point. I love that. Yes, excellent. I know, absolutely. Hi, how you doing?
Good. That's going to be a tough act to follow, although I think we've lost some of the crowd, so maybe that's okay. Is there a way for me to advance the slides, or you do it from there? Sure. I can just kind of. Yep, that's fine. I can kind of give you a nod. Well, thank you for having me here. My name is Ethan Connor Ross. I'm with eConsult Solutions. I'm a principal there. We are an economics and policy consulting firm based out of Philadelphia that does a lot of work in the transportation space. And we have been working with the borough's Rail Restoration Committee and with Chester County through a grant program on this study for several months here, looking at the economic and equity impacts of the potential rail restoration. There's a full report, which I believe you have, and this is kind of a summary of it. I'll take you through some slides here that summarize our findings, but happy to take kind of any questions. And please jump in and stop me if you kind of have a question as we go. This slide kind of lays out the organization of the report and how the study is constructed. We go through a few things, and this is what I'll talk through in the presentation. Just some context for the project, then expenditure impacts from the construction and operation of the restored segment, catalytic impacts, which speaks to the notion that transportation enhancements really change the underlying economics of an area, and what does that mean for property values, for development, other social benefits. Equity benefits, which was an important aspect the borough asked us to add to this study, and we're really happy to look at. And then importantly, funding options. How would this actually work and come to fruition over time? In terms of inputs for the study, on the right side of the screen, we did rely on a lot of the prior planning work that has been done by DVRPC, by PennDOT, by the Rail Committee itself. So we don't develop a unique estimate in this study of the project cost, of the ridership. We're kind of taking those inputs from prior studies and saying, given those inputs, what might that mean for the economics of the project? Obviously, these long-term forecasts, these assumptions are imperfect. We need to acknowledge that in the study. And we're not trying to be exact about that. We are trying to translate, given those assumptions, what would that mean for the borough and the economy? So historical kind of overview of the project. I'm sure all of you know this, but the SEPTA service used to run out to Westchester through 1986. There is about a 12-mile segment that no longer runs. The first 3 miles of which from Middletown to the Wawa station is currently being restored and about to be opened. What we think is really crucial here, having looked at a lot of different kind of rail projects, is that the right of way is really intact through Wawa, obviously, but really all the way to Westchester. The borough is currently leasing the segment and kind of holding that there. So obviously there are major capital costs that would go with this project, but a lot of the challenges in rail projects, rail enhancements, are kind of clearing the land, getting the right of way. That is not an issue here. So that is an extremely valuable asset that kind of remains in place. On the next slide, we look at growth patterns, and this is really important context too, both in Chester County and then kind of in the townships that Westchester and the surrounding ones that would be served by these stations. We have seen significant population growth in the years since going back to 1980 when the service existed. So 70% increase in Chester County's population from 1980 to 2020, almost a doubling in Westchester and the surrounding townships. And that is expected to continue kind of out to 2050. So looking at some of the kind of the county documents, the question really is, if you have that growth, what are you going to be able to do to accommodate it? And the county, from a planning perspective, is very interested in maintaining the preservation of open space while kind of managing that growth. And we look at transportation enhancements and the train in particular as an opportunity to say, if you're going to concentrate population growth in certain places where you have the infrastructure to handle it, that is sort of a natural goal there and allows you to kind of preserve that open space as well. The next slide summarizes some of the prior studies that we looked at. I kind of alluded to these in terms of the ridership forecast from DVRPC. They are projecting, or were as of this study in 2011, about 1,900 new riders on the line. Some of that would be diverted ridership, whether from the Paoli-Thorndale line, other bus service, so a net new ridership of about 1,400 per day. The 2015 committee report that we looked at some different scenarios and is recommending an electrified line as kind of the preferred alternative, which would be kind of coordinated with the service that SEPTA already runs, allowing it to kind of run the same trains through all the way to Westchester. And then also looked at this in comparison to other projects. And then the PennDOT feasibility study in 2018, this really was an engineering assessment, which is really important. They went down the track, they looked at kind of the infrastructure and structural requirements, came up with a similar kind of preferred scenario in terms of how this would best operate from a capital and operating perspective. And this is where the estimate of $380 million that you may have heard for the infrastructure improvements comes from. They also maintained that same ridership forecast. They did not, they kind of validated it. They think the conditions are still similar, but did not issue a different one. So as I referenced, that's kind of the work that we're building from. The $380 million, what does that mean from an economic standpoint? We do modeling of kind of indirect and induced impacts, and I won't get into all of that here, but the notion that when a dollar is spent in the local economy, there are impacts to that throughout the supply chain. There are impacts from the folks that work on that job site and then go out and kind of spend that money in the economy. So the total number that we've got here is about $600 million in impacts within Pennsylvania and $250 million within Chester County from that capital spend. That's a one-time impact. So that is just, as the project takes place, then once it's up and running, it does not recur. What does happen is the operations ongoing. And this spend is actually a more reasonable or certainly a lower number. And the reason for that is that, SEPTA already has, obviously, the components of this service. They've got the conductors, they've got the system in place. And so you're really just looking at it from kind of an incremental standpoint. They already have a staff that they do, a certain number of trains, et cetera. Obviously, there's going to be additional costs to continue to run service, but you are benefiting from sort of all of those operational efficiencies to say, we're just going to take up an existing route and extend it further. So we came up with an estimate of about $5 million a year in additional annual operating costs. And that was kind of doing a ratio analysis of what does SEPTA spend now and what kind of increment would we expect to see here. I'll talk next about catalytic impacts. And I kind of referenced before that these are really interesting from the standpoint of taking an area that already has a certain kind of market value and really enhancing it through new service. You jump to the next one. Some of this content is kind of covered as we go here. First thing we look at from a catalytic standpoint is residential property values for single-family housing. And this is a case where basically homeowners that have access to a service like this, to regional rail in the case of this region, that acts as an amenity for their house and kind of makes it more valuable to them. And we've done a lot of study of this. We actually did a study for SEPTA a couple of years ago looking at amenity value across the region for their existing network. So analyzed hundreds of thousands of transactions and tried to do a method that really isolates accounting for all of the things that you can kind of observe about a house. How big is it? How many bedrooms? How old is it? Can we find a difference in the actual market price of housing directly correlated to proximity to regional rail? So we found a pretty significant premium across the region and kind of built on that work for this study. So looking at stations with sort of similar attributes to what's envisioned here in terms of how many trains, how far from center city, those type of aspects, what kind of premium would we expect to see? So we found a premium of about 2%, and that kind of has gradations by how close to the station, but overall within a 3-mile radius, about 2%. And there's about $7.5 billion of existing housing value, looking at transaction data, assessment data within 3 miles of the proposed stations. So the increment there is about $150 million in new value for single-family residential housing alone. So not new development, which I'll talk about in a second, but existing homes kind of becoming more valuable through that means. The next thing we looked at is kind of new development and land use implications, and this goes back to this kind of protected open space and managed growth story that I alluded to. The bottom line is that locations that have better transportation services, whether that's rail, whether that's good car infrastructure, bike infrastructure, et cetera, it adds to the value of that location, whether from a residential standpoint or whether from a business standpoint. And ultimately, from kind of a big picture supply and demand perspective, those higher locations are going to have a market incentive for more intensive development. So bigger residential, bigger and denser commercial locations, and higher densities concentrated near transit, as I referenced, ultimately take development pressure off of other areas within a township, within a county, for any given level of economic activity that you're going to have, sort of clustering and concentrating near that infrastructure. It really manages it in a way consistent with sort of the planning goals of the county. So what we've done is develop kind of a representative development scenario. Obviously, there's a lot of different ways this can go, but kind of looking at the market factors in the immediate area around the stations for the Westtown and Cheney stations in a kind of a more suburban context. We were looking at an increase in housing units kind of in the immediate area. And then in the borough itself, we were looking at additional value through enhanced residential and commercial activity, whether that is existing properties becoming more valuable or whether that is new development that, again, when you kind of change the economics of the region, over time, it is going to be kind of more attractive to bring that activity on board. So on the next one here, we kind of go through Westtown and Thornbury townships, and I'll go through these quickly, but we discovered, kind of drawing a radius around the stations, that there are 47 housing units within the quarter-mile vicinity of the Westtown and Cheney stations. If you do just kind of a conservative estimate of 0.5 units per acre, that would give a potential yield of 120 units and a significant increment in kind of what those new units would mean in terms of property value and in terms of residents in those townships. In Westchester Borough itself, we actually pulled some analysis from kind of a similar transportation infrastructure project we had looked at in Montgomery County, Maryland, and we had found about an 11% increase in property value related to that infrastructure. So again, this is representative, and obviously the market can move in different directions, but applying that to existing value in the borough, you see an increment of about $127 million there, $100 million of which is residential, and another $27 million from an enhanced commercial activity, which again is going to be a combination of existing properties becoming more valuable, and then over time, kind of more infill and more value created that way. So adding these three up, we get a potential increase in this scenario of $145 million in property value. There's obviously a lot of fiscal implications of this in a couple of different ways. There is that kind of premium on the residential property. There is the new development that's generating new property value. And the other thing that's going to come through this for the borough and some of the surrounding townships is earned income tax. So if you're able to kind of increase that residential population, attract people that are in the workforce, we'll see additional revenue on an annual basis there too. So adding these three up, we get in this scenario about $5 million in additional annual tax revenue. Not all of that is the borough. Some of that is some of these surrounding townships, but the majority of that in the borough. Last thing I'll talk about in this catalytic section, number of social and environmental benefits that we looked at related to transportation on rail, basically compared to cars and sort of shifting people among those modes. So reductions in emissions, safety impacts and health impacts, travel reliability, and of course this kind of protected open space with the notion, again, that sort of concentrating growth in effective ways can enable you to get all the sort of environmental benefits out of that. A couple slides here on the equity analysis that we did. Really important in a study like this to understand who are the populations that are impacted here. So we did a comparison of the demographics of the primary market area, which is really right around the proposed stations, and then a larger secondary market area composed of the borough and the surrounding townships. From a demographic standpoint, relative to Chester County, relative to Delaware County, where some of the project is located as well, you can see that the poverty rate is significantly higher in the primary market area, a significantly higher number of household incomes below $25,000, and then a higher proportion of minority residents than Chester County as a whole as well. So kind of in looking at who those beneficiaries are of the project, obviously those are populations also that tend to use transit more frequently. So a good match between kind of the potential beneficiaries of the project and the population of the area around it. Another thing that we looked at in terms of equity is really access to employment opportunities. And this really goes both directions. So for folks that live near the new stations, the ability to access the different commercial areas along the line, most notably, obviously, Philadelphia, and did some analysis of how many people are kind of living in this area here and working in Philadelphia. We got a question on this, which was a good one. Within Philadelphia, where are those jobs actually located? Are they transit accessible? And found that 71% of the residents from here commuting to the city work in Center City, work in University City, and really would be able to potentially benefit from that access to 30th Street and some of those stations. And then in the other direction, folks along the line that would have access to, obviously, the commercial center of Westchester, but also importantly, Westchester University, Cheyney University, and some of the jobs that are available there. Final couple slides here are on funding. We looked at a couple of somewhat similar projects just to understand as examples of sort of the funding mix there. One of which was the Elwyn to Wawa project, which is currently in its final stage, as I referenced. This one, a cost of about $180 million, was essentially funded out of SEPTA's budget through the state, through Act 89, and a little bit of supplemental funding to it, but largely they were able to kind of fit that in with their funds, with their typical capital program. I say that in contrast to the King of Prussia Rail project that's under discussion now, extending the Norristown High-Speed Line into King of Prussia. Much bigger project in terms of budget, more than $2 billion in 2025 dollars. And here SEPTA is seeking federal funding. So they're seeking up to 50% through the FTA New Starts program. And then that's going to require certain things in terms of a match, in terms of state funding, in terms of local funding. And if you kind of go to the next slide, this will be important. I'm sorry, if you can go back one. This will be important to kind of see how it plays out from the perspective of what are those local funding options going to be, and importantly, so what does the state enable? So from a federal standpoint, the transportation funding environment is very positive right now. Obviously, there's a big infrastructure bill out there that everyone is aware of. There's nearly $90 billion appropriated for public transit in the next 5 years, of which about $40 billion is for new capital investment. A couple of things about those dollars. There's a substantial emphasis on equity relative to some of the previous administrations in the competitive grant programs. And there are actually a lot of discretionary dollars in these grant programs relative to prior administrations. So they're not all formula driven and already determined. There is some opportunity to kind of make a case for a project and have that affect the outcomes. The state picture is a lot more uncertain. So SEPTA's capital and operating funding historically primarily driven by the state, more than 50% in the current fiscal year. And the state has made investments through Act 44 and Act 89 that have substantially increased infrastructure funding. But there is kind of a push now to think about what's next, to think about what's long-term. The notion that the gas tax may not be a sustainable source for funding as kind of vehicles change. So this is actually a big year and a big budget cycle for that because a lot of provisions from Act 89 are actually sunsetting this June. So it's certainly something to keep an eye on in terms of how the legislature handles that. And that's going to affect SEPTA and transportation funding availability going forward. The other wrinkle to that, which is addressed on the next slide, is that localities in Pennsylvania, and I'm sure you all know this, need appropriating or enabling legislation, I should say, from the state for a lot of the local investments they may want to make. So that is true kind of in transportation as well. Some of the ways that a local match might be generated, statutory authority is going to be needed for the locality, the municipality, the county to actually undertake that. So I think folks are really keeping a close eye on this King of Prussia project to understand there is a lot of support for that at the state level. What kind of tools are the localities going to be given to make that happen? So I think from the perspective of a project like this, kind of seeing what they choose, seeing what's now authorized in law will be a really important step. There are some tools for what's called value capture, which is the notion that this additional value that I discussed earlier, some of the increment of that could kind of be diverted to bond funding to help support the project. There are TRID districts that can be created, which is similar to different other mechanisms to capture value. There is a Transportation Partnerships Act. So a couple of mechanisms that exist and already have been enabled. We talked about this kind of local revenue generation on the order of $5 million in the scenario. Clearly, that's not going to support, the full cost of a project. I don't think anybody is sort of looking at it from that perspective. I think the notion here is some of these larger sources require a local match, and B, the local funding commitment can kind of demonstrate that the locality kind of has skin in the game and is committed to the project, and that may help unlock discretionary funds being appropriated or awarded to the project. Last thing I'll say, I know there are some plans to potentially do this kind of in increments. That's not what our study has looked at. We have looked at kind of a full restoration, but that is another way that kind of smaller dollar amounts can potentially help to kind of get the ball rolling, demonstrate interest in this, demonstrate demand for this, and move forward from there. So that concludes kind of my remarks here, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you for that. A lot of information there. Very thorough. Thank you. Questions? Yep, go ahead, Mr. McCoy.
You mentioned at the end the smaller projects, incremental. I'm assuming that the economic impacts that you look at, because doesn't go the whole way to Philadelphia or whatever, are not proportional.
Yeah, we didn't evaluate that scenario. So none of the numbers that I kind of presented are related to that. I think that would be an interesting question. I think obviously if you can make that connection all the way to Philadelphia, there's some folks that can benefit from that, maybe in a similar way to the full restoration, but you certainly wouldn't assume that everything is exactly proportional, and we haven't done that analysis.
Great report.
Thank you.
You presented it in a very good manner that I can write down notes as you were talking.
Okay.
Some of them may not make sense as I go through them, but it's going to be really brief. Let's start with the ridership. 1,480 people a day, right? So I extrapolated that out $100 a week, and it's like for a year $7 million, which is good. The cost to run the line is 5 million that you said. So that's a $2.2 million positive swing. You know, for SEPTA, they should consider that. But then when you add in the $380 million of the upfront costs to do it through fast calculations, it's going to take SEPTA 52 years to pay off their investment. How close am I?
That's some good math. I'm not sure.
I'd
have to.
It's called Reaganomics.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm that old. I apologize. No, it's about 52 years to pay it off. So that's probably why they're hedging
Yeah.
their bets. And that was just fast math when you were talking. I mean, we all would love to see SEPTA come all the way here, but it's pretty obvious that, you know, 52-year return on investment is kind of tough, you know. And I was told that their rail lines don't turn a profit, which I found very staggering. I thought everything should make a profit.
Yeah. Well, I was actually gonna note that. I don't think that they operate on kind of a strict net profitable basis in terms of their fare recovery relative to kind of their overall budget. My understanding is about, I want to say 25 to 30% of their revenue comes from fares. A lot of it comes from kind of government support. So, you know, I think they would have to kind of look at it in this context. Obviously, if there's an investment that they're able to make that is purely going to pay for itself in fare revenue, that's great, and they're going to jump at that. But I do think they make other investments when you look at their capital budget that they certainly wanted to have a stable operating profile going forward. They don't want to kind of take themselves further negative, but I don't think that they view it as kind of strictly cost and return basis that way.
So all the numbers that we look at in terms of operating costs, that is all SEPTA's operating cost.
It is, and I do want to be clear, that's not a projection from SEPTA. So we have taken their operating budget, kind of tried to figure out how many incremental, more trains, more headcount, and applied that. So that would be SEPTA's operating cost to run it, but that is not their analysis or their number.
Okay, and then in terms of feasibility from our looking at our local municipality here, what would we need to be? What would we have any part of that, or is that just SEPTA kind of runs the game? We're just mostly looking to advocate for it and get it to come here, and maybe looking for some funds. Yeah, my sense is the operating piece of it is manageable because again, it's sort of benefiting from their existing system. I think the $380 million that was just referenced, that is the funding challenge, the investment that's up front. So the idea is not that a municipality is going to be in position to cover that entire cost, obviously. But are there ways to say, there's value being generated from this? We're expecting more revenue on an annual basis because of the value this is creating, the new jobs, et cetera. Can you take kind of an increment and capture that in some way that contributes to the upfront cost? Gotcha. And then when you're looking at getting grant money either from levels ahead or even like the federal grants, is that something that, once again, SEPTA is advocating for and pushing for? Or is that something that local municipalities are really trying to get?
That's a good question. I think both. You certainly need SEPTA to be kind of on board and supportive of the project. And I know that's part of the kind of discussion that's ongoing here. But I think in the case of King of Prussia, there's actually even a sort of a local advocacy group that has kind of brought together because there's different municipalities involved. There's different businesses. I think partners are really important here, and obvious ones that would come to bear would be Cheney and Westchester University, right? To add those stops are real positive for them, whether they are sort of financial contributors or there are other ways that they can kind of bring that support to the table. Okay. That would probably be important as well.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Ms. Vaccaro? Yeah.
All of your presentation was phenomenal, and thank you very much. But the talk about raising property values in Westchester frightens me slightly. I think we already have a lot of gentrification concerns, and can you just talk on that for a minute? I know you sort of touched on it, but can you give me more?
Sure. Yeah, and we always do kind of run into this question and can address it in a couple of different ways. I think from a value generation standpoint, it kind of is what it sounds like. An additional amenity is added. So whether I'm a resident that now has access to the station, that's a positive. But a lot of that comes through the location is more attractive. So you may want to build, let's say, a bigger apartment building there than you otherwise would have. You may want to locate an office building there, something like that. And so a lot of that does create the value. I think kind of the flip side to the housing cost issue, and this is something we've looked at for SEPTA as well, because they actually, we did the study in the city of Philadelphia, and they expressed the exact same concern. It's great that people value the service, but is this increasing housing costs ultimately? So the flip side of that is actually transportation costs. So if you have households that one of their biggest line items is the operation of their vehicle, the ownership, the operation, the gas, all of that, you do have the ability through riding the train or accessing other transport to yield a pretty significant savings off of that, which kind of counterbalances some of these housing cost issues. We looked at it across Philadelphia and actually found that the transportation savings on net across the city outweighed the housing cost increases for the average household. I want to emphasize with this too, you kind of think about no car households in that, and there's certainly some of that. You can save a lot of money going no car, but there are many households, maybe they could go from 3 cars to 2, maybe they could go from 2 to 1 by having the train either as an option for kind of how one person commutes, or even just the fact that it's there can be a backup option, et cetera. So that is certainly a concern that sort of raised here and makes a lot of sense to me. But I think the sort of overall package of savings should be looked at too.
So thank you for your presentation. I hear you talk about equity, and I hear you talk about impact. And I'm wondering what the negative impact is, because your spin is only on the positive impact. And I'm sure there's some detrimental impact to some of these communities. And I'm wondering what they would be, such as parking, such as being too close to the station.
Sure.
Because you indicate property values would go up, but doesn't the same thing happen if you're too close to the station? They go down.
That's a really interesting question. So we've looked at the existing regional rail stations in kind of distance bands. So for example, looking at properties in the first half mile, then kind of the next half mile, 1 to 2 miles, et cetera. We do find a positive impact in the first half mile, but it's actually lower than the next band. So being a half to 1 mile away from the station, being 1 to 2 miles from the station, actually shows a bigger premium in the housing transaction data we've looked at than the houses in the immediate vicinity. So that does make sense with kind of what you described. There are some negative impacts of being right next to a station, but we have found on balance still kind of a positive out of that. I think the housing cost issue that we just talked about, it can certainly cut both ways in terms of whether those increases in value are helpful for a particular household or not, depending on kind of what their financial situation is. But the other piece to this that I think is unique, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, is the fact that the right-of-way is intact. So this is not a case where there's kind of existing, whether it's open space or whether it's other uses that would have to be fundamentally disrupted. The track is there, it's sort of not in use. So the concern about the stations themselves, I definitely understand that you are going to add kind of some more flow through those areas. You may have some properties immediately impacted, but not to the same degree, I think, as if a new right-of-way had to be generated that would really be kind of displacing a lot of activity.
And to that question, if you're talking about increased ridership, speak to the parking issue. I'm thinking of the station in Westchester now that already has a parking issue in the area, even with just the recreational train being utilized. So now you're talking about daily impact. And I'd also like you to speak to the statement that communities, racial and ethnic minority residents in the PMA are more likely to seek jobs in Center City, Philadelphia. Really? You have a statistic that says that? I would be very surprised.
Sure, I can speak to both of those. So
Yeah.
as from a parking standpoint, this is definitely one of the considerations that SEPTA has kind of across its regional rail system. The parking, certainly on the Paoli line I'm most familiar with, is at capacity for a lot of stations. So they do kind of tend to fill up their parking lots. They look at parking structures if that's necessary. They look at kind of how many spaces they can get because that parking is really directly related to their revenue. Going back to the conversation that we had earlier, the more people they can kind of get on the train on a daily basis, that's going to make a difference from an economic standpoint for them. In terms of the commute data that I alluded to, we were looking at current commutes. This can be changed, obviously, if the transportation network changes. We did find that the kind of number one municipality that folks are working at beyond Westchester itself that live in the area is the city of Philadelphia. That doesn't mean it's the majority of people. We have the number in here. It's probably about 10% of the residents of the area working in Philadelphia. But that was the kind of top one that came up in the list of which municipalities are residents commuting to.
I just had one more thing, and hopefully we wrap this up. But you had mentioned like an overlay district. Was it a TRID or something? Is that what you called it?
TRID, yeah.
Can you explain just like what kind of impact that would have? I can understand what a bid is and even a NID, but I don't know what the TRID would mean in terms of like what you would put in that area, what the overlay would do.
Yeah. So it is actually a value capture mechanism, which is to say the properties that are defined within this improvement district, you kind of take a measure before the project of what is the assessed value there, and then another one in the future. And there is kind of a legal and contractual mechanism where you say you're going to continue to collect the same property value off them that you began with, but some or all of that increment, that increase in value, is going to be captured, is going to be set aside in a particular fund, and then you are able to fund some of the infrastructure improvements off of that.
So not increasing, you're not increasing a cost on them per se as a municipality, just they're going to end up paying more in taxes because their property value goes up. We can just allocate essentially a portion. Is that what you're saying?
Yes,
based on that?
They're going to pay more. The borough and the school district are either made whole or can collect some of the increase depending how it's structured. And then another portion of the increase is kind of diverted to the funding. Now, this is a case where typically these need to be approved by a majority of the property owners. So, they're going to need to be convinced that the benefits that they're going to see from this project and this investment kind of justifies that additional cost from a business standpoint.
Gotcha. Okay. Great. Well, thank you very much. With lots of questions. Mr. Metrick, we have to approve the study, just that the way we see it, is that kind of how? Well, it says approval on there. I'm not sure.
Yeah, council can vote to accept the study as it's presented.
Okay. Is that something we should just vote on now, or we can just put it on the consent, or?
Put it on the consent.
Put it on the consent. Okay. Okay. Are we all good to put this study as presented on the consent agenda? Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it and answering all the questions.
Thanks for the questions.
Yeah, thank you. Any comments from anybody out there before we move on? Okay, so we'll approve that. Consent. Number 6 on our agenda is a presentation by Will Williams on an update on our single-use plastic bag ordinance. I had asked Mr. Williams if he would be willing to come and just kind of give us an update on how it's going with the local businesses and just kind of like a update.
Yeah, and cool to see the students here. Obviously different group of students, but if you weren't aware that, and this predates me by a few years, but similar group from Westchester Friends came in and kicked off this plastic bag, plastic straw ban 2017, 2018. So cool to see that. Just a reminder, our ordinance went into effect January 1st after 2.5 years of delay. I'd guess today we're about 80 to 85% compliance. It's a rough estimate based on my own experience walking and spending money at our establishments. I'd say we started at about 20%, so we've made slow but steady progress since January 1st. I've been out 89 times, I keep track, 89 times to businesses since January 1st. Try to find a few hours a week to do this, but frankly, it doesn't always get done with all the other things that we're working on. These are friendly visits. They're usually after we receive complaints or I notice things. They're friendly visits. I go out, I provide information, my contact, I answer questions, take a little abuse, whatever they're in the mood for. My message to the businesses is the ordinance is here, we're intent on enforcing it. The community is watching, and that I'm here as a resource to help them comply. Some of the issues that we've come across, obviously confusion over the start date because we delayed it twice, which, you know, we were forced to do. That's not our fault, but there was a little confusion. There's been a lot of confusion around plant-based and biodegradable plastics, which are not really a thing, but some clever marketing people have branded them as such. I was reading, there's one very common brand out there that unfortunately some folks have started using without reading the ordinance. And I did a little research on it, and it's so such a strong material that they use it for like surgical pins and artificial cartilage and stuff when they're doing surgery. So needless to say, it's not actually breaking down in a landfill or the environment. Supply chains, of course, have been a challenge for everyone. People having trouble getting alternative products. Inventories, and this is something that I've told people when they say, hey, I got 2 boxes full of straws, I say use them. Because I think the only thing worse than a single-use plastic straw is a zero-use plastic straw that goes into the dumpster. And also staff education, you know, just like everything else, there's been a ton of turnover in the restaurant industry. I was at a restaurant talking to the manager, went back after a few weeks to really kind of give them a hard time, different manager, starting from scratch. So those are some of the realities on the ground as we try to get this going. We've only done 1 notice of violation. That's to Rite Aid. After my 3rd visit, they were issued a notice of violation. Before I got back to my desk, I had a call from a regional manager saying, paper's on the way and our staff's being trained this week. So if need be, we'll get there. But, you know, enforcement, I think, is proving to be a little harder than we thought. I spent the last 2 Saturdays in the rain at the growers market trying to interface with some of our Amish vendors. No emails, no phones, no websites. It's very hard to communicate them. So communication is always a challenge, but there's some unique things we really didn't anticipate. The folks running the market have been helpful, though. Admittedly, enforcement's been complaint-driven. I've encouraged them and will encourage them to do, but if it's not complaint-driven, then we're going to be basically me going out, staking out restaurants, which I don't think anyone envisioned. And then actually, if we need to move on to fining, citation, then you progress to fines. I think we need to actually do that. We need visual evidence of like the distribution of straws and bags. You can't just like walk by, you know, outdoor seating, see straws and glasses, and document that in a way that's going to hold up if it's challenged in court. And we need to really think about that. There was an interesting conversation last week in Public Works about the tree ordinance and the arborist and some of the difficulties we have citing things in really obvious scenarios. So we may need to amend the ordinance if it takes fines to bring everyone into compliance. So like I said, slow but steady progress. And while I have the floor, I'll share that West Goshen had an ordinance that went into effect last month on Earth Day. Philly went January 1st, just like us. And I would, if I were a betting man, I'd say East Bradford, West Whiteland, and Tredyffrin will all have passed ordinances similar or identical this year. So we're getting a major swath of 202 Route 30 corridor under these laws, which is great. And again, it all started with a group of kids right here. So any questions?
Thank you for that. Appreciate it. The 10, the 15, the 20% that, you know, we're not compliant, sounds like you gave a couple of reasons why. Are there any businesses that are just like, we're just not going to do this? And like,
I think there'll be 1 or 2.
Okay. All right. That's interesting.
So that's why we're thinking ahead to what that actual process looked like.
Yeah. I think we do need to, because it's just a fact that businesses won't do it unless we make them. I mean, you could look at East Bradford and they go to the Giant there, like they'll use plastics until you tell them they can't anymore. Like they will do it. So I think there has to be some kind of enforcement and there has to be accountability. Because I think once some businesses catch on that, hey, you can come, Will's going to come in here every month and yell at me, but then at the end of the day, nothing happens, then they're not going to change. So
Exactly.
Council, any Mayor? Go ahead.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but was there supposed to be like a line item on your bill for
a paper bag? Yeah.
Because I haven't seen that
Yeah.
by anybody.
I've seen, I haven't seen it on a receipt because frankly, I haven't gotten a paper bag. but I've seen some signage at stores about it, so I know it is being done in some places. But that's a great example. If we're going to actually advance to citing someone for not doing that, then we're going to have to obtain sales receipt. We're going to have to document that someone got a bag. We're going to have to obtain sales receipts that show there's no 10-cent fee. So the advancing to citing someone and providing that evidence that will hold up is, I don't think we really anticipated how difficult that was going to be.
And then one other thing, in West Goshen, you said it just got implemented, but they are on it like that.
Yeah.
I mean, everywhere I've gone in West Goshen, they're like, when you say, can I have a bag? Because I frequently ask for a bag, and they're like, it's 35 cents.
Yeah.
And they say 35 cents. And at Wawa, they have these great little red bags, and so does ShopRite.
Yeah.
They both just, you have it for the one time, and then you can get to reuse it.
Yeah.
So, and their red bag is only 35 cents, because it's like they're giving it probably below cost or at cost.
Yeah, something they did really great, which it's not too late for us to do, but they've actually they created the materials for the counter, the window, the storefront, whatever. We did flyers, and I have seen a lot of them posted up in, behind the counter or by the register, but they weren't formatted specifically for, the checkout space or the door to remind you as you walk in. So it's not too late to do some of those things. And that's kind of cool to learn from people who are going after us.
I thought they rolled it out pretty good, and,
Yeah. I will say,
and the
though,
fact that it was 35 cents, and we quibbled over 20 cents and reduced it to 10 cents.
yeah. I will say, though, in West Goshen that their supervisors are doing enforcement. So I'll just throw that out there.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
All right. Get a badge, Bernie. All right. Any other questions or anything for Will? I appreciate you coming out and updating us on that, and we look forward to seeing how things progress going forward and what we might need to do to make changes if we need to. So.
And we'll do another report, maybe just at Act Committee, but we'll do another report in 2 or 3 months.
Great. Thank you. Good. Okay. Anybody else have anything from this item? Sorry, I didn't ask the public. Okay. Okay. Item 7, voting wards redistricting proposal. I know this is going through ACT. Mr. Allen's not feeling well, so he won't be here, isn't here tonight. Mr. Metric, just want to give an update on how this is kind of panning out, or?
Yeah, sure. Just so everyone who's listening and everyone who's attending and members of council, right now this is a draft solution to our problem, which is that we have to rebalance our voting wards according to the recently published 2020 census data. And we want to do it in a way that no ward has a population that's 10% greater or less than any other. So it's a numbers game to balance the ward's population. We also looked at racial and ethnic demographic information to make sure none of these proposed new districts were in any way diluting minority representation, which was the whole reason behind the voting ward system argued 35 years ago and prevailing. So this map looks a little different than the one that we currently have, insofar as there are a few changes. I went over them in the ACT committee, but I'll just focus on the largest change, and that is happening in the large, there are 2 census blocks that account for the student population living on campus, and that's a very large number. That's around 3,600 total. So our game plan when Mr. Allen and I were sitting down with this problem set was to balance the non-student populations in wards 3, 4, 5, and then equally cut up the student populations roughly into thirds and apportion those into wards 3, 4, and 5. What we don't know and what we didn't consider and what we need your help with is, does this map make sense from a neighborhood distribution viability sense? I don't know the neighborhoods as well as you all do. Did we make rational decisions according to which neighborhoods are most like the other ones and where are the natural boundaries in our town? We need some help with figuring that out. This works from a mathematical point of view at this point in time, but this is a tool for conversation and discussion at this point.
Yeah, I think there definitely has to be like an ongoing look at this. My initial thought with especially 3, 4, and 5 down there with the student population is that it's really hard to kind of get that number, especially like in the 4th ward. Students live there, but not many of them vote in the polls. So it's they might be a resident there, but they're not a registered voter, and they're going home to vote in their home district or whatever, and they're only there for sometimes less than a year. So it is really tricky to kind of look at that, but you still have to account for it. Many of them do vote, but
yeah, and let me clarify too, when I'm talking about students as identified in the census, I'm just talking about the dots that are located on the university-owned property where the dormitories are.
Yeah.
And I know there's lots of students living in houses and apartments in 3, 4, and 5 and all over the borough.
Yeah, and it's tricky too because there are some instances where polling places are now not in the wards anymore. So we have to think about those things and take into account other things like if we're still living in our wards anymore. So, which I don't think any of that changed from this map, but yeah. Mr. McGinnis, kind of.
Yeah, thank you. The only comment that I made, and I made this to Sean and Nick, was that we, and I should say we, as in Representative Ward 3, we would take part of 4, and that part of 4 where they vote would be in Ward 3. And so I think, which is the Public Works building. And so, and I've mentioned this to Sheila, is, leaving that alone, Mike, and having, again, that natural dividing line be High Street, and then maybe shift it down 3 where all of Sharpless would be in 5, which would make sense because they vote right across the street in Sharpless, or that part of Price Street down. The only other feedback I got besides that is what's going to happen at Chestnut Square. Does that go into 2W? Does that go into 1? Now that 1 will be its own quadrant in the northeast, with that dividing line being High Street. So I think there could be potentially room to shift down, maybe on both sides, and see where that population shift is. But as I mentioned, the conversations that I had with people, and yesterday I spoke with Sue Bain about this, is everything is still preliminary right now. But that was my major concern, is where people vote in Ward 4 would be in Ward 3. And what we would want to do is make sure that where people vote is going to be where they live, and it's going to be in walkable distances from where they live.
Yeah, and Mr. Metrick, what's the plan going forward to continue this conversation? Are we going to just keep going back to committee level? Is there separate meetings we'll have for this, or?
I think the committee might be a good place to handle this business if you're okay with that, Council President. And we can, now that Council has seen the tool, the document that we've created, the web app that we've created, we can provide feedback directly to the committee by email.
I think that works. I think there should still be a little bit more of an outreach. So maybe either like a special meeting where we bring in some of the community leaders from various wards to kind of come in and give their perspective and see how it will impact their wards. Just to keep making sure that we have, all people that have, that are involved in this, and that, the leaders in each ward have an idea, a way to kind of come to a public meeting and really take some time. That's not going to take, an extra hour at a committee meeting. I feel like if we had a special meeting, it's something that really might take a while. So, yeah. Is there in terms of timeline, does this have to be done by the end of the year at a certain time? When does this have to be, do we have a specific time, or is this ongoing?
That's a fair question. Let me get a good answer for you on that. I know we started with plenty of time, thanks to Councilperson McGinnis bringing it to my attention and Council's attention.
Okay, great. Any other thoughts? Mr. Carey.
I looked over this, and for Ward 5, I'm comfortable with it, and I heard no complaints from the people I did talk about it with. I do have one concern. Having worked at the polls in Ward 5, which are actually outside of Ward 5 and at the university, I had to hand walk university students to their proper polling place because there is such confusion at the university as to where they vote. And having the university chopped into 3 wards, I think, is very confusing. I have no idea if it's even remotely possible to make that less confusing, but I would like to say that out loud. Thank you.
Yeah, heard that. Any other thoughts? You what? Oh. Oh, okay. Okay, great. Any other comment from the public? Anybody out there? Okay. All right, great. So this will be continued in the committee level and then possibly looking at, a special meeting of some sort to really tackle it in detail. Thank you.
I just wanted to say one thing, I'm sorry. While we're looking at it, I think it's still as important today as it was when the ward system was enacted, that we keep the integrity and the reasons for the ward intact.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Okay, moving on to our committee items. First under Act, we have number 8 is approve a resolution for the Saturday, September 17th Up on the Roof event. We've generally approved this every year. This is an event that I've still yet to go to. I'm putting it on my calendar. I need to get to this event. So, any issues with this? Okay, that'll be on the consent agenda then. Thank you. Public Works, on item number 9, authorize the solicitor to draft an amendment to the Chapter 102 trees, requesting administration enforcement in Section 102-10. This was 3-0 from the committee.
Yeah, the reason why that's on there is because the arborist was not legally allowed to cite tree trimmers for doing damage.
Yeah, I didn't realize that. After I read it, I was like surprised by that. So, any issues with this or consent? Okay. Okay. Moving on to item 10, approve awarding the pavement marking alternate bid 1 and 2 in the amount of $15,444 to Alpha Space Control. That sounds very NASA. This is a committee 3-0. I don't have much information on this. Any?
Yeah, last year the borough joined a consortium of West Goshen, East Goshen, West Town, and Euclid townships to collectively bid for long line painting services because it requires different equipment. There's economies of scale. So bids were solicited for a standard paint base bid as well as a hot thermoplastic paint. Bernie could tell you more about the difference.
Yep.
We included double yellow lines, white lines, and stop bars. So our bid came in for the standard base paint at $3780.15, and the hot thermoplastic alternate bid was $24,014. So the Public Works staff has the equipment to do the stop bars in-house with standard paint. So we're going to go ahead and recommend we do that. And we're requesting award of the alternates bids 1 and 2, which are the hot thermoplastic long lines. That's in the amount of $15,444.
Okay. Questions or concerns? Consent? Okay. Thank you. All right, that'll go under consent. Moving on to public safety. Item number 11 is approve a resolution to designate emergency service providers in Westchester Borough. For my time on the public safety, I feel like this was mostly a formality. Is that correct, Ms. Dorsey? Yeah. Okay. So we usually have to update this from time to time, every year or whatever. So any issues with this or any? No. Okay. Consent on that. Moving on to item 12, which is approve a resolution for the closure of Gay Street PennDOT special event application.
Now, this is the process we've gone through the last 2 years to close Gay Street. So this is just we've already sent this special event application in. This is just putting suspenders on our pants where we already have a belt to make sure our pants don't fall down.
Yeah, just making sure in case we don't get the final we don't get it back. I understood.
Yes, we are very hopeful the abandonment will come through and we'll get the signatures we need and we will sprint it over to the Recorder Deeds office.
Got it. Okay. This is kind of our backup plan then. All right. We consent on this? All right. Thank you. Item 13, approve the rules and regulations for the summer open air market on Gay Street. This was 3-0 from the committee. I took a look at it. It looked very similar to what we had last year, if not identical. I had no issue with it, so. Okay, consent on that. All right, and then 14, schedule a public hearing for liquor license application. This is for White Cow, 16 East Gay Street, to be on June 14th at 2022 at 6:30 p.m. They're applying for an economic development license, I believe, correct? Okay. Any issue with that time for that hearing? Okay. Okay. You have a question? Or?
Does the borough have a limit on how many liquor licenses?
So for normal R licenses, there are, but this is this would be applying for an economic development license, which has different restrictions on it. And as far as I know, there's no limit. But as far as I know, I don't think they're been approving them recently. So, but yeah.
I do have a question about the economic development license for, this was formerly, this is next to Sidebar, correct?
Yeah. It was
the classic diner, correct? So my question is how can they, or why are we even acknowledging getting an economic development license in the first place? I think that, I mean, again, it's just a question out there. I don't know if someone from that committee could answer that, because I think it is against of what we're trying to accomplish here in the borough. That's just my thoughts.
Yeah. I feel, and I don't know if this is right, and Mr. Metrick, maybe or if this was discussed at public safety, but I feel like them applying for it, we have to have the hearing, but I could be wrong. So at that time then, but if that's correct, unless I'm wrong, we actually have to have this hearing because they applied for it?
Correct, yeah.
Okay. So we have to have it, and in a certain amount of time frame. At the hearing, though, is when we can decide. And at this point, I'm in.
No, thank you for the clarification. Appreciate it.
Okay, so we're 3-0 for that. Or I'm sorry, we're in consent for that. We were 3-0 for the committee. Moving on to 15. Schedule a public hearing for the Responsible Contractors Ordinance on June 14th, 2022 at 7 p.m. This was 3-0 from the committee. Okay, we're consent on that as well. 16, approve modification to the technology capital budget. This was 3-0 from the committee. I know, Mr. Mann, you talked about this at the...
Excuse me, very quickly. We just had servers scheduled for this year, firewall scheduled for next year. The next generation of our server has been delayed. So we just swapped the projects to keep on pace with our infrastructure.
Okay. Any issues with this or consent? Okay. 17, Public Works State of Good Repair, maintenance and repair of streetlights. That's $30,000. Committee recommended this as well, 3-0.
The reason why we recommended it was because that we didn't have a line item for people running into streetlights. They're the actual poles that people knock down. And if we can't recover the money from their insurance companies, we still have to put the streetlights back up. But there's no line item on there. And Ms. Liani thought we should allocate some funding because we don't have any money to do it.
Okay.
So I'd like to add that this is a request on the American Rescue Plans as well.
Okay.
That's where we're asking the money to be allocated from.
Okay. That makes sense. All right. Are we consent on that?
Yes.
Okay. Great. Thank you. 18, enter into a professional services agreement with traffic planning and design for the High Street corridor, High Street at Minor Street, CRP design, permitting improvements project in the amount of $115,000. This was 3-0 from the committee as well.
This professional service agreement will get us through final design, permitting with PennDOT, bidding, bid management, and then construction project management with TPD running point on that. We expect construction costs are estimated in the $425 $400,000 to $450,000 range. So I would anticipate the item discussed earlier on tonight's agenda will come into play when that comes out to bid.
Sure.
And this is a project that came out of the High Street corridor plan that TPD did for the borough in 2019.
Yeah. It's been like this has been a long time coming. Questions or concerns on that or consent? All right, we'll put that on consent as well. Moving right along. We're on to item number 19, approve submission of the Chester County ARPA grant application for Goose Creek electrical infrastructure. Mr. Williams, I know I saw your presentation at the committee level, but this is 3-0. Okay.
So I'll cover this quickly because we went ahead and submitted today because the deadline was today. So I'm here to ask for a little bit of forgiveness. But the county, just like we got $2 million, the county got $102 million. They're dispersing a lot of it, most of it, to municipalities through competitive grant process. The Goose Creek electrical infrastructure is the biggest thing in our capital plan. It's about a quarter of the estimated capital spend at the wastewater plants over the next 4 years. It checks all the boxes for our ARPA project, and we thought it was the strongest, not only the biggest, but the strongest project in our capital plan. So we went ahead and went for it. There's no match, so there's no resolution or commitment needed from council at the time, but we still wanted it approved.
Yeah, my favorite kind of grant, no match grant. I don't see any issue with this. No, yeah. All right. Thank you for your quick work on that. I appreciate that. Yeah. So that's consent. All right. 20, approve the amendment to the professional services agreement with O'Donnell Nacarado for construction and management at the Bicentennial Garage. This was 3-0 as well. Don't recall what the amendment was.
This is an amendment to the existing professional service agreement we have with O'Donnell Nacarado, which is our consulting engineer on Bicentennial and Chestnut Street garage repairs. They have requested addition to the contract to complete the work that they need to do supervising the work at Bicentennial Garage, which we are now about 2/3 of the way to completion.
Okay. All right. Any issue with that? Consent? Okay. Thank you. Moving on to 21. Approve a resolution to authorize Sean Metrick and Barbara Leonti as signers on Truist pension and capital operating accounts. This was 3-0. Ms. Leonti, you want to just?
This is just a resolution to, take off Mr. Perone and put Mr. Metrick on as a signer as well as myself. And the bank needs a resolution to be signed by Borough Council in order to do this.
Okay, makes sense. Any issue? All right, consent on that. Thank you. Moving under smart growth. By the way, was there no HARB meeting this month? I feel like there was no HARB agenda items. I was like, where are the HARP stuff? Okay, usually there's like 15 of them. Okay, sorry. Item 22, approve the platform extension for Mercado Restaurant and Bar at 33 West Market Street. They're just extending their platform. I saw the plan on it. I'm like, can you explain that a little bit, Mr. Gore?
Yeah, it was just an 18-foot extension in the eastern direction along Market. They had it the past 2 years. The police didn't have any concerns with it. It's 8 feet from the from the alley. So they've had, like I said, up the past 2 years, there were no concerns.
And this goes in front of the business next to them, or no? Oh, the other way, I guess the alley. Okay. All right. Well, this was 3-0 from the committee, unless anybody else has an issue. Okay. Is it?
An issue with it. I'm going to discuss it tomorrow.
Okay. So that'll have to go in discussion. Okay. Thank you. All right. 23. Discuss zoning hearing application. This is number 995-220. That's at Lacey Street. Oh, at 220 Lacey Street. Sorry. Michael Jamochian, applicant, seeks a special exemption for the installation of an accessory structure, which is a shed, in accordance with 112.802.J5. So this was just asking if we're going to send a solicitor, and the committee recommended 3-0 not to send a solicitor for this one. Anybody see a reason why we should send a solicitor? Okay. Okay, all right. So that being the case, we don't need to consent on that. That can just go away, correct? If I say the right thing. So 23 will just be gone because we're not going to act on it. All right. Oh, wow, we're going on. 24, other business. Approve the April 19th and 20th, 2022 Borough Council meeting minutes. Any issues with the minutes from last month? All right, we can consent to approve those. All right. Is there any other business? Wow, okay. Thank you, everybody. This meeting's adjourned.